Hello, everyone, and welcome to Africa Fire Mission's weekly virtual training session. My name is Mike, and I'm the programs director here at Africa Fire Mission. We're so happy that you took time out of your busy schedules to join us for today's training. Today, we're going to be taking a look at small engines, how they work, and how we can maybe do a little maintenance or repair on them. Before we get started with today's training, just a couple of administrative notes. If you stick around for at least 70% of today's training, which is usually about 40 or 45 minutes, you'll receive a certificate of attendance for today's training. We'll try to drop some information in the chat for you later on about where you can get to our Google Drive, where you'll find a recording of today's training, as well as all the other trainings that we've done so far this year. If you get online, watch the video, and answer a few questions about the training, I can get you a certificate of attendance for those as well. So if you get disconnected or you want to go back, you're new to us, you want to get some of the classes that we've done earlier in the year, I encourage you to check that out. You can also find that on our webpage at www.africafiremission.org. And if you go to the resources tab, there's a bunch of great information for you guys, some free training materials and things like that. So I encourage you to go there and check that out as well. When we get finished with today's training at the top of the hour, we'll have tea time. Tea time is a time when you can ask questions about today's training or discuss anything else that may be on your mind. It's a great time that you can do a little bit of networking or something like that. So I would encourage you to stick around if you have the time in the bundles for that as well. At this point in time, we're going to jump right into our training. Just bear with me a second and we'll get things started. All right. So today we're going to talk, as I'd said earlier, about small engines. We find these on a lot of different uses here in the fire service. Just a couple examples of how we might see these or how we might use these portable pumps, whether they be a water pump or as a separate pump that may be on your fire appliances. Sometimes you've got a separate engine-driven pump. We would consider a lot of those a small engine. They'll have some of the same components that we're talking about. So we'll look at those. Your generators, be it an electrical generator or a hydraulic generator that you might use to run some power tools or something like that. You find them on power saws. There's lots of different types of power saws that are out there. You've got your bigger cutting saws that you can use for cutting through roofs or other heavy materials. You've got chainsaws you can use for cutting through wood or cutting up down trees or removing debris and things like that. Ventilation fans are another use that we might see some of these small engines. So basically, what we're talking about today are any of these petrol-powered tools that you may have, and a little bit about how they work, how we maintain them, and how we take care of them. Okay. The first thing that we're going to look at is what type of engine is it that runs these tools, right? There's two different styles of engine. One is the two-stroke, also you may hear it called two-cycle, or four-stroke and a four-cycle engine. And we'll go back and look at those and see what the differences are. If we step back to this first slide for a moment and look at some of these, typically our water pumps, those are going to be a four-cycle engine or a four-stroke engine. Your generator, your vent fan, and your hydraulic generators, all of those are typically going to be what we'd call a four-stroke or a four-cycle engine. Your cutting saws, your chainsaws and things like that, those are typically going to be a two-stroke or a two-cycle engine. So what are they? What's the difference? So the first one we're going to look at here is the two-stroke or the two-cycle engine. These work a little bit on a two-stroke system. So you can see in the diagram there's just an upstroke and a downstroke of the piston in the engine. And as that piston moves into the upward position, that's where the inlet port opens up. It draws in a mixture of air and fuel, and it closes that transfer port for a minute, closes the exhaust port, right? On the downstroke, what that does, it opens the transfer port, which lets the fuel and air mixture up into the cylinder. It closes the inlet port off, and that's where the spark plug fires. When the spark plug fires, um, it ignites that mixture of fuel and air, causes a little explosion, which pushes down on the cylinder, opens the exhaust port, the exhaust goes out, and then this cycle just continues. So it's basically two strokes that opens and closes that inlet and outlet port. Sort of simple. Now, a four-stroke cycle is a little bit different. Now, that piston, what's working when that piston moves is just a little bit different. Okay, so on the intake stroke, you can see the pistons moving in the downward direction. It's opening up letting that fuel air mixture in. As it works its way back around and the piston starts to move back up, that's the compression stroke. So it compresses that fuel air mixture. When that fuel air mixture is compressed toward the top of that stroke, the spark plug fires, which initiates the next stroke, which pushes down on that cylinder. As the cylinder is rotating down, that opens up then the exhaust port. The exhaust port opens, the exhaust goes out as that cylinder returns back up to the top. So two different styles. Really, it's similar in that piston's going up and down. The movement of that piston is caused by the explosion, caused by the spark plug. The spark plug ignites the air-fuel mixture, and that's what pushes that piston down, causes the rotation. As those pistons rotate, that rotates the engine, which powers our saw, which powers our pump, which powers anything that drive shaft is attached to. Your bigger engines may have multiple pistons. Most of our two-stroke engines that we look at, our chainsaws and things like that, they just have a single piston. So that's sort of the basics of the two-stroke or the four-stroke engine. Is it important to you to know what you have? Is it important to know whether you have a two-stroke or a four-stroke engine? Well, certainly it is. How can we tell whether we have a two-stroke engine or a four-stroke engine or two-cycle, four-cycle? Same thing, they can be used interchangeably. Okay. On the two-cycle engines, okay, you're going to see on the left-hand side of the screen there, this is your fuel cap, okay? And that fuel cap will have some sort of writing on it. It's going to tell you that you're mixing fuel and oil together. And this is the really important, if there's nothing else that you take away from this whole training today, I want you to take away the idea of how to figure out whether we've got a two-cycle or a four-cycle engine. Because with that two-cycle engine, we have to mix oil in with the petrol, okay? A two-cycle engine, the way that engine gets its lubrication is from the oil that's mixed with the fuel. If we don't mix oil into the fuel in a two-stroke engine, and I'm sure that some of you may have experienced this because I know that we've seen a number of two-stroke engines, chainsaws, and things like that are being used without mixing oil in to the petrol. It will work. A chainsaw will run with just straight petrol, even though it's a two-stroke engine. The problem with that is that it burns hotter and there's no lubrication. So while a two-stroke engine will run on only petrol without oil mixed in, it will damage the engine. 100% guaranteed. It will not run forever like that. Okay, so it's critical if you're fortunate enough to have the opportunity to have a power saw or to have some sort of tool powered by that two-stroke engine, it's critical that we add that oil into the petrol to prolong the life of that tool and to make it function properly. Okay, so how do we know if it's a two-stroke? We look at that cap. That cap will give us, in this particular example, it tells you the ratio that you mix. So it's 50 parts of fuel to 1 part of oil. There's a special oil that you should use. It's labeled as a 2-cycle oil. When you purchase the 2-cycle or the 2-stroke oil, it will have on the bottle, it will give you instructions for mixing that will tell you how much of that to add per liter of petrol to get you the right ratio that you need. Typically, the tool will tell you the right ratio. We'll touch on that in a little bit. When you look at a 4-cycle engine that runs on straight petrol, those are going to have a separate oil reservoir somewhere on that engine. So down there on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, I've got a couple pictures of some fuel caps that you might see, or excuse me, some oil caps or oil drains that you might see. Okay, so if there's a separate reservoir, a separate place for you to add oil, that is an indicator that we've got a 4-cycle engine. So we can use straight petrol in that. We don't have to mix oil in there. But we do then need to check and make sure of the engine oil level. There's various ways to do that. Sometimes there's a dipstick, like you can see in the very bottom right-hand corner. That's a cap. That's an oil fill cap that has like a metal dipstick on it. Sometimes you'll see the one in the upper left-hand corner. That has a little bit of a dipstick on attached to that drain. So the same place you could drain it, you can fill it, and also check the level. The one that's on the bottom left-hand side, if that's the only oil fill cap that you have, typically when the engine is sitting upright and you take that out, the level of the oil should just be level with the bottom of that opening, and that's how you know that you have enough oil in the crankcase of that engine. Okay, so 2-stroke engine will have only a fuel reservoir and should tell us on the fuel cap that it has a mixture. That's not always the case, especially with chainsaws. Especially like the Steel brand chainsaws. They don't have any kind of writing on there. And don't get confused there as well. A chainsaw has a place for you to add fuel, and a chainsaw has a place for you to add oil. The chainsaw is the exception to what I'm talking about. The oil that you add separately for the chainsaw is used for lubrication of the chain, not for lubrication of the engine. So that's sort of the exception to that rule where I say a 4-stroke engine has a separate fuel reservoir. The chainsaw is the exception. Chainsaws are exclusively 2-stroke engines. They do have that place where you add oil, but it's not engine oil. It's bar oil, and that's a little bit different oil as well. A chainsaw bar oil has some additives in it that make it sticky, make it a little bit tacky so that it stays on that bar, compared to engine oil, which is a lot slicker and has more viscosity. It's slippery. So 4-stroke engine, we're going to have an engine oil reservoir and a fuel reservoir. 2-stroke, typically just the fuel reservoir. Hope that makes sense. I hope I made that clear. That mixture ratio that I was talking about with the 2-stroke engines. A lot of times you'll find that mixture on the fuel cap. If it's not on the fuel cap and you're fortunate enough to have the documentation that came with it, the user manual, a lot of times you can find the mixture ratio in the documentation that came with it. Now everyone's got smartphones. So if you can jump on your cell phone and do a quick internet search, if you know the name, the brand name, and the model number or the model name, you might be able to find the fuel oil mixture ratio there as well. Um, when you're reading that ratio of 50 to 1, so we're talking 50 parts of petrol to 1 part oil. Um, they can range anywhere from 16 to 1 is about the lowest that you may see, upwards to some two-stroke engines run on like a 100 to 1 mixture. Uh, the rule of thumb, most of the two-cycle engines that you guys would be working with and that are recently made, um, pretty much a lot of the manufacturers switching all to a 50 to 1 ratio. Okay, so 50 to 1 is what most of the newer engines use. As I mentioned before, oil in the fuel lubricates the engine. Um, if you're going to make an error on your mixing ratio, I would say that you would want to go on the side of putting a little more oil in than less. It would be a little better to have too much oil than too little oil. If you have too little oil in your mixture, then what's recommended, that's hard on the engine for heat buildup and things like that. You may damage the cylinder. The downside to too much oil is that it can cause what we call fouling on the spark plug. So um, the spark plug can get kind of soaked with oil or get too much oil buildup on the spark plug and not function as much. And we'll talk about spark plugs in a little bit more detail in just a little bit. So that's that two-stroke ratio, uh, and maybe how you can find that, how you can use that. Okay. How do we start these engines? This is the part that can get a little bit tricky. You know, every engine has a little bit different procedure as to how it starts. Um, but we'll just sort of talk you through, if it has this feature as we talk about it, use it. If it doesn't, of course, you're not going to use it. And there's two different procedures. There's what we call a cold starting procedure and a warm starting procedure. Um, these can vary a little bit. Certainly, they vary by the climate that you're working in as well. Where I'm at, it can get very cold in the wintertime. Trying to start these small engines in cold weather is difficult. They don't want to start. Um, where a lot of you guys are at, the weather is pretty much is similar most of the year, right? Temperature wise, you don't get as big a temperature variation. Maybe it doesn't get real cold, but when we say a cold start, we can mean that the outside temperature is very cold, making the engine itself physically cold. But we also just mean that the engine hasn't been run for a while. So if the engine hasn't been run for a while, we're going to follow this procedure for a cold start. So the first thing we're going to look for is a start and stop switch. A lot of engines have this. This is one of the most frustrating things that you might deal with. You're pulling and pulling and pulling, trying to start this engine, and you just forgot to turn that switch from off to on, or from stop to start. So check and make sure if it has a switch that's labeled either on or off or start stop. Make sure you've got that switch on. First step, definitely all the time, turn the switch on. If it's got a choke, you want to put the choke on. Typically, cold start, we're going to pull the choke all the way out so that the choke is fully on. We're going to take a look at some carburetors here in a little bit, and I'll show you where the choke is and how it functions and what it does. But basically, that's limiting the amount of air that can come into the engine, giving us a richer fuel mixture for starting it off. If there's a lock on the throttle, we want to lock the throttle open. That may be some sort of a trigger lock, or we can just if the throttle, you just adjust the throttle, sort of by hand, set the throttle on high. If it has a priming bulb, right, there's a little rubber bulb that you can pump to pump some fuel directly into the carburetor. It's got the priming bulb. You can push that 3 or 4 times on a lot of the newer engines that have that priming bulb. There's actually an overflow that you can't pump that too many times. It'll just pump it through the carburetor and then back out again. So usually 3 to 4 times is pretty good on that priming bulb. Some of your bigger engines on a bigger chainsaw, I don't have my big boy here with me at the moment to show you, but some of them, there's a decompression button on top of the cylinder. You push that button and it makes it easier to pull the pull start. If it has one of those, you can push that as well. So then those are all the settings that we fool with, that we adjust, that we get set on our engine. Now we're ready to actually try starting it. We're going to pull that pull cord, and we're going to pull that cord until we hear the engine pop. That's the way I describe it, is sort of like a popping sound. It's like the engine starts, it wants to start, but doesn't completely start. And as soon as we hear that the first time, as we're pulling the first time, it sounds a bit different. We hear kind of a popping sound, or it tries to start. We're going to stop right there. Okay, we hear that popping sound. That might even, if it has the engine decompression button on it, it'll pop that button back out. We're going to stop right there. We're going to stop pulling, and we're going to turn the choke off. Once it tries to start for the first time, we're going to turn the choke off. If we do that, if we catch it as soon as it pops that first time, we turn the choke off, pull that cord 2, 3 more times, that engine should start up and run. Okay. If we don't hear that pop for that first time, and we leave the choke on for too long, fully open for too long, that can cause a condition that we call a flooded engine. If we flood the engine, we basically get the spark plug wet with fuel. We've got too much fuel in our mixture in order to ignite and start. The engine won't start then. There's a procedure for starting it if we flood the engine, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Let's assume that we didn't flood the engine. Our engine's up and running. We're operating it for a while, and we shut it off. And then we need to restart it. What's our warm start procedure? So, again, warm start. Yeah, if the temperature's hot outside, we can use the warm start procedure. But if the engine hasn't run for a long time, we're still going to use the cold start procedure. This warm start procedure is what we're going to use after we've had the engine running for a little while. So now, to do our warm start procedure, there's just a few steps to that. If it's got a start-stop switch, turn it to start or turn it to on. If it's got a throttle lock, we're going to lock the throttle open, or we're going to turn the throttle to the wide open position. If it's got an engine decompression button, we're going to push that. Notice no mention of the choke. That's the difference. On a warm start, we're not going to use the choke. If the engine's been running for a while, the engine's hot to the touch, it's nice and warm outside, we don't need to use that choke. We're just going to set the start to on, lock the throttle, maybe engine decompression if it has it, and then we're going to pull that pull cord until it starts. That's your warm start procedure if the engine's been running. Flooded engine. I mentioned that earlier. How can I tell if it's flooded? How can I fix it? We can tell that we flooded the engine because the engine won't start, right? You pulled the cord a whole bunch of times with the choke on. No matter what you do, it's not starting, it's not starting, it's not starting. There could be a different issue with the engine, and we'll talk about diagnosing those in a little bit. But one of the key factors that you'll notice if you flooded the engine is you're going to have a strong smell of petrol. Okay? If you smell a strong smell of petrol after you've been pull for a while, and that smell wasn't there, and now you can strongly smell it, you've probably flooded the engine. What do we do about it? How do we fix it? It's not the end of the world. We can get it to start. It's just going to be a little bit of physical work. So how are we going to start that flooded engine? Again, start, stop, switch on, the choke off, definitely choke off. Get that throttle wide open. hold it wide open. If it's got, whether it has a lock or not, we need to have that throttle wide open. And that's where I say it might take two people. If you've got a chainsaw that doesn't have a throttle lock, you need somebody to hold that trigger all the way open and somebody else to stand there and pull that cord. And you're going to pull and pull and pull and pull. It may take 10 pulls on that cord. It may take 20. It may take 50. If the engine's flooded and we have the switch on, the choke off, the throttle wide open, and we keep pulling it, eventually it will start. If there's nothing else wrong with this with the saw, it will start. So that's the procedure for that flooded engine. Is to just keep pulling with a wide open throttle, the choke wide open. As you pull that, it will dry out that cylinder. As you're pulling it, pulling it, pulling it, it will dry that out enough that you'll eventually get the condition you need, the right air fuel mixture for that to spark and start the engine. So that's how we're going to start that flooded engine. That's one of the problems that you may run into with these small engines. Real quick, talking about how to diagnose these small engines. This is the engine triangle. It's the same as the fire triangle. Um, in the fire triangle, right, we need fuel, oxygen, and heat in order to have a fire. If we take away any one of those legs of the fire triangle, the fire goes out. For an engine, you've got the exact same triangle, just different terms. The terms are fuel, air, and spark. Okay. So we'll talk about each one of these. Oh, yeah, there's my fire triangle. Oxygen, heat, and fuel, right? We're going to call them in the engine fuel, the same air for oxygen, and spark instead of heat. So if we're trying to quickly diagnose why this engine won't start or what's wrong with it, and we think there's a problem with the fuel, couple things to check. Is there fuel in the engine? Maybe it's just empty, right? So top the fuel off, make sure there's fuel in the engine. The next thing to check are the fuel lines and the fuel filters. We're going to look at a chainsaw. We're going to look at a carburetor there. And the one I'm going to show you, the fuel line was was old, it cracked and just broke. So check the condition of the fuel line. The fuel line should be soft and supple. It shouldn't have any holes in it. Check the condition of the fuel line. If there's a fuel filter on that fuel line somewhere, check that, make sure it's not clogged. If those are okay, fuel lines are okay, there's fuel in it, there's no problem with the fuel filter, our problem is in the carburetor. We'll talk about that later. We'll talk about how to check out the carburetor, how to clean the carburetor out. If everything's okay with the fuel, we move on to the air. And is there an air filter? Is the air filter clean? Can air get through the air filter? So we'll look at that air filter. We'll hold it up to the light. We'll see if the light shines through it. We'll that's really about all there is to check with it with small engine. Condition of the air filter. The bottom there, what can I use for an air filter? If the air filter is bad, I'm going to show you some alternatives. But any kind of foam. I've got just a piece of sort of some foam that I got. I don't even know what it's from. I can cut this into the shape of that air box on my small engine, and I can make my own air filters. So as long as that foam's in good condition, it's not crumbling, it's not going to suck parts of that foam into the engine, you can improvise and make your own air filter. We'll look at that again when we get into the engines and stuff. Checking for spark, that's the last component. You're going to look at that spark plug, look at the condition of that spark plug, and see what that condition of the spark plug is. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. The other thing you're going to do is you're going to check for spark. And we didn't get a spark plug, but we'll show you we'll talk about how to do that. But essentially, you're going to remove the spark plug from the engine. You're going to plug the spark plug into the spark plug wire, and then touch the metal part of the spark plug to any metal part on the engine. Okay, So the spark plug is out of its hole, it's touching the metal part of the engine, and then you're going to pull your pull starter. And when you do that, you're going to watch the tip of that spark plug, and you're going to look for a spark. If you can see the spark, we know that works, right? We know that's not our problem. If you look at the spark plug itself, the condition of that spark plug will tell you maybe what's wrong with that engine as well. And I know this chart's probably difficult for you to see if you're watching on a phone, but at the top part of this chart, it's showing you what a normal plug looks like. It's showing you some of the issues that it may be. If you get online and search for this chart, maybe I'll drop it into our extra materials location as well, in our Google Drive folder. I'll drop the link to that right now in the chat. There'll be an additional materials folder. Try to drop that chart in there for you. That will help you to figure out what's going on with your spark plug. It's a great chart. It tells you the symptoms of your engine, what your spark plug looks like, and then what to do to try to fix that. So that's a really handy reference. I'll drop that, make that available. I'll maybe drop that into your WhatsApp groups as well a little bit later, so you guys have that. Okay, so those are the different components of the engine. We're going to try something a little different here, and we're going to switch around and take a look at an engine and see what's going on. So I'm going to stop my screen share here. We're going to switch things around a little bit. And we're going to go like this. Aha, here we go. So, excellent. Now, let me make one more adjustment on my side here. Okay. All right. You good? All right. So here we've got a chainsaw. Something I want you to take a look at on this chainsaw as well here. I always talk about using your locally available resources. This chainsaw I got, and it had a problem. The fuel cap had broken off and twisted off. And what I did with this chainsaw to get it up and working again is I took the top of a drink bottle, and I used some adhesive that was safe to work around fuels. And I'd open this up, and I didn't have access to a new fuel tank for this chainsaw. So I used some adhesive. I used a drink bottle. I glued the top of the drink bottle to it. I've got my drink bottle cap. I screwed it on there, and I ended up using this chainsaw for a while afterwards because I improvised my own cap for the chainsaw. So don't be afraid to do some of those improvised things if you need to. Some of that. Here's some of this foam that I was talking about. It's just a piece of packing foam that you could use as an air filter, and we'll check that out as we begin to look at this chainsaw and where the carburetor is. Everything's in a little bit different location dependent upon what saw or what engine you might be using. On this one, right up here on the top, there's a cover that's going to cover up where my carburetor is. So we're going to dig into that and take a look at that carburetor, where that is, and how it works, that sort of stuff. So we take that cap off on this particular one, and in here, here's the air filter. When I pull that out, you can see, it's the same. It's no different than this piece of packing foam that I had. So if this needed to be replaced, I can just cut a new piece, stick it down in there, and I'm off and running if I don't have the resources to buy a new one. Okay. Underneath of this air filter housing, this is where our carburetor sits. I've got to remove that housing. I'm just going to take these screws out. And when I take those two screws out, most of the carburetors are always just held on with two screws that are held into the uh, air filter housing. So I can take this little piece off, pop this carburetor right out. And this is what we've got here. This is our carburetor for a chainsaw. Okay. Um, Here's where our fuel comes in. This is our fuel line, and this fuel line is okay. Um, it's still soft and flexible, but the fuel line on the other side over here, this is the one that I was telling you broke off. It was old and cracked. Okay, so that was a problem with this one that needs to be addressed. At the top of this is the top of the carburetor, and here's the choke lever. The choke lever was attached to this. I don't know if you can see how well you can see this, but as the choke opens or closes, this flap sort of covers. There we go. Okay, here we're opening the choke and closing the choke. Okay. Uh, Inside this carburetor, on the other side, this is our throttle here. And as we open this flap, that's going to let air in. And I've got a bigger carburetor to show you. Okay. But just what I want to show you here on this carburetor, if we take this apart, there's a couple components inside this. This is your two-stroke carburetor. If we take this apart, let me stay right there. On the bottom side of this carburetor, we'll show you some of the components in here. When I take this bottom piece off on a two-stroke carburetor, this is where you've got to be careful if you're gonna open up your carburetor to try to clean it out. On this piece here, there's a diaphragm here, and this little rubber, it's sort of made out of a rubber-like material. It kind of bounces up and if back and forth. This is what opens and closes to allow the fuel to move through the carburetor. You can take that piece off. You want to inspect this piece. If there's any rips or tears in this, that's probably what's causing you your carburetor issues. Okay, so a carburetor rebuild kit would include a new gasket like that and a new piece with that diaphragm. So you want to be super careful if you're taking this apart to clean it. Inside here, there's all sorts of small little passages that need to get cleaned out. On the top side of this carburetor, if we take this piece off, on the top side we've got another gasket, and this gasket has these little rubber diaphragms on it as well, these little flaps that cover the holes on the surface, and that these flaps let the fuel travel through and into the carburetor. So all of these passageways need to be clean and have no debris or anything in them. Okay, so if we open these carburetors up, that's what we're going to do, is try to clean out all of these passageways. This is a two-stroke carburetor. Okay, we'll show you here a four-stroke carburetor that's much bigger, so that we can get a better idea of how these work. So let me move these off to the side here, and we'll bring over a two-stroke engine. Here we've got a two-stroke engine, or excuse me, a four-stroke, four-cylinder, four-cycle engine. Okay. Let's. The fuel tank usually sits up on the top of this engine, but here we've got our air filter. And let me just make sure we can see. Yeah, okay, good. So this is where our air filter is. There's the cover. If we remove this cover for this air filter, again, on a lot of these engines, this air filter is just a piece of foam. Okay. So we can replace that with just another piece of foam, right? Just like I talked about on the chainsaw engine, here we've got just two little nuts that are holding this air filter housing onto this carburetor. So we'll remove that. Remove those two nuts. Now that those two nuts are off, I can slide this air filter housing off. It's got a little breather that goes back to the top of the crankcase. And here's our carburetor. Okay. Um, at the front of the carburetor, there's this flap that opens and closes. This is our choke. When the choke is closed, that's closed in the starting position. Over here is open. All right. This carburetor will just slide right off now, and it's connected to the throttle in the back here. So we just disconnect that throttle. And here's our carburetor. Okay, so on the back side, we've got the throttle. When you open the throttle, basically what that's doing is letting more air travel through the carburetor. And as more air travels through the carburetor, the way this carburetor works is here, this is the bottom, this is the bowl down here. Okay, the fuel comes in and fills up this bowl on the bottom. And then as the air comes in this side, where the choke is, and the air filter's on this side, okay, the air comes in through here, and as you open the throttle wider open, that allows more air to flow through this carburetor in this direction, from this side to this side. And as the air flows through there, it's using what's called the Venturi effect, right? If we flow water or air through a narrow passage, the pressure inside goes down, which creates a vacuum, and that draws the fuel up through those little passages in the carburetor. Up, that draws the fuel up in, it mixes it with the air, and then it comes out this side, goes into the cylinder, which is in here, and then that's how our engine cycle works, right? So that's how the carburetor functions. And I have a bigger carburetor yet that I want to show you that will tear apart. Let me just quickly show you. I talked about that spark, checking that spark plug for spark. This engine, I don't have the spark plug in it and I forgot to grab one. But essentially the spark plug sits in here where my finger is. Okay, we're going to take that spark plug out. Be sure that the spark plug is plugged into the boot here. Okay, and then when you do this test, you're going to be sure you're holding on to the boot and not touching the spark plug. But then touch the spark plug to the metal of the engine up here, the head of the engine. Touch it anywhere up here. And then when you pull the pull cord, okay, and the engine turns over, you should be able to see a spark. If you can't see a spark, either your spark plug is bad, or um, or there's something wrong with the electrical part of the engine that it's not generating that spark, right? So that's how you're testing for that spark. Let me show you just what do we got 10 minutes. Cool. 10 more minutes. Let me show you on a bigger carburetor what that looks like and what you might want to get into and do a little bit of cleaning and things like that inside. Okay. I'm going to work right down here if you can. You good? Okay. So this is a little bit different. This is a carburetor off of, it could be off of a motorcycle or some kind of a little bit bigger small engine, but it's nice that you can see the different components of it. So the one thing that appears to be missing on this that's a little bit different, this piece right here is where the choke would be. This has an electric choke on it, so it works a little bit differently. So normally you would see over here on this side, this is the intake side of the carburetor. This is where the air comes in. So your air filter will be attached on this side somewhere. Normally you would see the choke flapper in here. but it's over here and it's electronic. It's a little bit different. This side would be the choke. And then if we spin it around this way, on this side is the throttle side. So that's the flapper that when I twist the throttle here, maybe it's a little hard to see, but that throttle opens up. Okay. So let's open this. So then this carburetor sort of works the same way. The fuel comes in down here on this side. This little hose hanging off the bottom. A lot of times the bottom of a carburetor will have some kind of a screw or something down at the bottom. Typically that's to drain that bowl. The bottom bowl is where dirt and debris can get stuck and that can cause problems. And actually this one's really dirty when we open it up. So you'll be able to see. The top side of this carburetor has our needle valve in it. So switch tools a second. We'll take this top off. When I take this top off, we've got a spring here, and then we've got this diaphragm and our needle valve. So this moves up and down within the carburetor there, and that's what allows that's allowing that fuel to get drawn up in through that Venturi effect. So on this particular one, we're going to take this out. You're going to check to make sure that this rubber diaphragm is in good shape and that it's not torn. There's no holes or anything. Clean up this needle to make sure that's nice and clean. Make sure that's nice and smooth. Okay. That's the top side of the carburetor. Then there's this bottom bowl down here. I'm going to take this bottom bowl off. Now, when I open up this bottom bowl, in the bowl, there's this plastic float. This could be another issue that you might run into, is this plastic float may get some cracks or break a little bit and get fuel inside there, and that doesn't work properly. This float is what shuts your fuel off as it's coming into the carburetor. Now, the bottom of this, you can kind of see there's a lot of white stuff. There's this white powdery stuff in here. This carburetor, there was some contaminants in the fuel. Okay, so this would all need to be cleaned out. This is probably what was causing me problems with this carburetor. Okay, so we'll clean all that stuff out. We're going to switch over and look back here. This is one of the most important parts of this carburetor. There's different passages and things that move through these carburetors. But here are two jets. These are called jets. And these, we want to remove these and clean these up. And these are the passages, and these jets this affects how much fuel travels up into the mixture. And changing these jets changes how the engine runs a little bit. These are made out of brass, and hopefully we'll get this out so you can see. These are going to be difficult to see. On the tip of this little brass piece, there are a whole bunch of tiny little holes. Okay, if these tiny little holes get clogged with some kind of debris or something, it's not going to work. Okay, so we want to make sure that these are all clean using like a carburetor cleaner, maybe a thin piece of what they call mechanics wire to make sure that's all clean. Take that jet out, make sure that's clean. There's two different jets. There's a bigger one here that we take out. Make sure these passageways are clean. This one has a bunch of little holes running up the edge of it here. Okay, and this top part of this jet comes out as well. Make sure all of these passages are clean. There's no debris in them. Okay, clean all these up. and then you'll put all of these back in. Okay, the jets, they go back in and they just tighten right up. You put those back in, tighten them up as tight as they were. The other thing to look at on these carburetors, there's some adjustments on a lot of these carburetors that adjust the amount of fuel that gets in and out. On this particular carburetor, here's your adjustment here on the side, okay? With this adjustment screw, this controls how rich or lean your mixture is. And it's not tight, okay? So if I want to take this out and clean this, on most of your carburetors, the sort of standard position for this is 2.5 turns out once you make it tight. If the engine was running good before you decided to clean it, we want to get this set back to where it was. So what we will do with an adjustment screw, any kind of adjustment screw on these engines, we'll count how many turns it is until it's tight. So for this one, there's half, 1 turn, half, 2 turns, another half, and a quarter. So this was at 2 3/4 turns tight. Okay. So now I just write that down, 2 3/4 turns. And now I can take this screw completely out. It's another one of those components that has little holes and things that we want to make sure are clean. We pull it out. There's the spring attached to this. This one has a little needle point on the end of it. Make sure that that needle point is clean, that there's no dirt or debris. There you can see it's got a sharp little point on it. We clean that out real good. And then after we've got this cleaned, of course, we're going to clean the passage that it was in as well. We'll clean that out as well. Then we'll put that back in. And then, well, how do we make sure we get it properly adjusted? Well, we wrote down what it was. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to turn this back in tight. Once I get that all the way tight, I remember that it was 2 3/4 turns. So I'll do my quarter turn. Now I'm going to go half, 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, and I'm right back to that setting that I started with. My carburetor is all clean. I can start to put my pieces back together, reassemble everything, and try again. That's cleaning a carburetor, the different components of it. We're getting right up against our time. Let me give you just one last comment about these small carburetors here for those 2-stroke engines. Relatively speaking, these carburetors are inexpensive. Here in the US, I can get a new 2-stroke carburetor for a chainsaw or something like that for usually $20 US or less. For me here in the US, matter of fact, actually, this big carburetor that you could use that comes on like a scooter or a go-kart or a motorcycle, these actually are also only about $20 US. The reason I have this one I could tear apart for you, instead of me adjusting or trying to fix the carburetor, I just bought a new one. And sometimes that's all that's really needed to get your saws up and running. So if you have that power tool, you can find these 2-stroke carburetors for $20 US. They're manufactured in China. I've had chainsaws. I've had friends with chainsaws that aren't running, and I've said, I tell you what, you give me $100 and I'll fix your chainsaw for you, right? So they pay me $100. I get onto Amazon. I order a $20 carburetor. I put that $20 carburetor in, and it's up and running again. No adjustments or anything like that. So with these little 2-stroke carburetors, they're inexpensive. They're readily available for me. I don't know if they're going to be readily available for you all, but just something to think about there. we're up against our time, so let me make some adjustments here and get us back. Let me get us back to, where am I? Where did I go? Here we go. I'm back. Okay. So that was small engines, care and maintenance. I would encourage you, um, if you're going to, if they're not, your engine's not working, um, take a look at trying to clean it. Take a look at trying to clean that carburetor out some. You've got to be careful with the gaskets that are in there. You don't damage some of those gaskets and things, but if you carefully open up those carburetors, clean them with some kind of a solvent or something, put them back together, you may be able to get those back up and running. Um, we'll open the floor to some questions and things in just a moment here, but we're up against our hour, so let me sort of wrap up the formal portion of our training here with a big thank you to you all. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedules to come and join us today. Thanks for using your bundles to get your data to be here with us. From all of us at Africa Fire Mission, we really appreciate that dedication that you have to your community. You join us here every Wednesday to be a part of this. So thank you so much for being here. We've got plenty of seats in the house. So invite your friends, invite anybody that you think might benefit from these, whether they're a prospective firefighter or they're working on the job. Plenty of places to go. With that, I'm going to thank you all and hope to see you all again next week.